Hello everyone, it's Hoplite Mike. I hope you're all well. Today I wanted to have a look at some of the armor in the Rings of Power, because putting the story and the characters to one side, I did have high hopes of seeing some good designs in this show. This is something I think they really nailed in the original Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings films, so let's jump into some of the elven armor we've seen in episode 1 and 2. I also just want to say, I'm not someone who thinks it should look like authentic armor from the medieval era, because ultimately this is fantasy and it's a TV show. We want to be entertained. I would rather the armor looks eye-catching, striking, or at least interesting. The elven armor from the Peter Jackson films, for example, has an elegance and air of grandeur about it. In episode 1, we saw the elves of the First Age in their fight against the orcs, led by Finrod. We also saw some ceremonial armour, and lastly some guards around that ceremony, but not in any close detail. This video is going to focus primarily on the First Age design. I'm also going to consider the ceremonial armour and say a few words about the guards as well. The segment where we see the First Age armour is quite short, so I've had to make do with the best shots I could get. This is a fairly basic design compared to what we've seen from the original Lord of the Rings films. You have a silver chest plate, pauldrons, rare braces, and then vambraces over the forearms. It seems like they have gone for a minimalist design with the helmet. It's universally gold, has an open face, a neck guard at the back, and then a small design in the ear area. This does not look like something from the medieval era. This looks much closer to a design we would have seen from the ancient times. The way it looked actually reminded me of a Roman helmet at first, with the neck guard, but I think overall it's much closer to an ancient Greek helmet, especially the face section. I'm not sure why they didn't add a crest to the top of the helmets. It's a small thing which would have made a major difference. That said, the helmet that Galadriel picks up seems to have one, so I don't know if this is only for commanders. The helmet itself actually isn't dissimilar from the Peter Jackson films, it just doesn't look as sleek. The Rings of Power helmet is much more rounded, and the neck guard is quite rigid rather than being incorporated into the design. In my opinion, the Lord of the Rings films helmet does look better, but I wouldn't say it offers better protection. It's quite hard to see, but they are wearing some sort of neck protection underneath the breastplate, although I think it's fair to say the neck is still somewhat exposed. In the medieval era, you might have had a bever, or at least used chainmail to protect the neck. And you can see here the Peter Jackson elves do have chainmail going up their neck, which means their necks aren't really exposed. There isn't much to say about the chest plate, it's fairly standard plate armour. I actually do like the gold on silver, but it lacks the ornate design of the elves in the Peter Jackson films. In those films they weave in the different colours from the tunic and the chainmail, with the elaborate design of the armour to create a visually stunning look. The design in the Rings of Power is just more simplistic and minimalist. The fact this is thousands of years before the High Elves of the Last Alliance means this actually might make some sense. Overall, it just lacks the wow factor you get in the Peter Jackson films, but it's not bad. Then we have the shoulder pieces. In real life, the initial shoulder armour that was used in the medieval era were called spaulders, developed in the 14th century. They were basic pieces of armour that only really covered the shoulder. In the 15th century, these evolved into pauldrons that were bigger and also covered the armpits, and in some cases even part of the chest or back. The shoulder pieces from the Rings of Power are arguably closer to pauldrons, just given the large area they cover and the fact they do arguably stretch down to cover the armpit. I think the shoulder pieces is where the armour in the Rings of Power really loses some of the elegance from the elves in the Peter Jackson films. They are much more chunky and make the wearer look like they have broader shoulders. It's just a fundamentally different look. The ones from the Peter Jackson film look more like spaulders that offer less protection, whereas the ones here offer more protection but are also bigger and more cumbersome. Although it is important to note that Finrod doesn't seem to have any trouble raising his arm above his head. I know this might partly be driven by the fact the elves here are all melee units and not ranged, whereas the ones we see in the Peter Jackson films are usually at least hybrid ranged units. So wearing shoulder pieces this big wouldn't lend itself to archer fire, but unfortunately we don't see any arch units in this Rings of Power episode. I do like the look, I just think it's worth noting that there are some gaps here which could be exploited. And it's not clear if there's chainmail under the armour. There is then some upper arm protection in the form of rare braces, and then vambraces which cover the forearm. They are separated by what I believe to be a cauter, which is just a piece of metal to protect the elbow that became popular in the 14th century in real life. This is not something that the Peter Jackson film elves have. Their elbows are protected by chainmail. Like with the pauldrons, the cauter is quite chunky and therefore cumbersome. It gives the armour a more medieval look than a fantasy one. In terms of the leg area, I found it difficult to get a good shot of this. They seem to be wearing chainmail with armour beneath. It's not clear whether it's full body chainmail or just for the lower area, but this picture makes it look like it's just for the legs, so it's like a chainmail skirt almost. Visually it looks good, but I'm not sure how practical it is to have chainmail flapping about. Overall, when you compare the design from the Peter Jackson films, I think the Rings of Power armour feels a lot closer to what would be medieval armour, with the pauldrons, cauter, and fairly bland chest plates, rather than being lavish elven armour for a TV show. Some people might like that, but I find it slightly disappointing because this is fantasy. You don't need to be constrained by the real-life armour from the past, and you can make it look as unique as you want. Daemon's armour from House of the Dragon is a good example of this, because I think this looks epic. It's also worth mentioning in the summary section that if my assumption about the chainmail is correct, which is that the Rings of Power Elves only have chainmail for the lower part of the body rather than the torso, then it means there's a lot more exploitable gaps than with the Peter Jackson elves, who visibly have full chainmail on. Up next we have the armour from the ceremony. I'm assuming this is purely ceremonial rather than functional, because everything looks massively oversized. It's similar to the previous armour in that it's clearly minimalist. The armour is silver with no accents, and there's very little in the way of carvings or ornate designs. The shoulder pieces are huge, and the neck pieces go way too high. There's a scene where Galadriel doesn't seem to be able to turn her head without turning her full body. I could go through this, but I'm pretty sure it's not for fighting. Overall, I don't mind it. I think it actually looks quite good with the cape. I just think it's not for fighting. Lastly, we have the guards who are present at the ceremony. We don't see them in any great detail, they're just in the background, and these are the best shots I could get. It's difficult to see what armour they have on because they're wearing a large tunic which covers most of their body. Again, they look alright, just nothing special. My only real comment on these is the colours. They're very one-dimensional, and I don't know if they're trying to match up the shade of gold with the Malon trees, but I don't think it really reflects the nobility of the elves during this time. But I'll refrain from making comments on them until I see them in better detail. That's going to be it for this one today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.